Long before the age of global surveillance and secret intelligence agencies, one man stood as a firewall against chaos, armed only with logic, courage, and a violin. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, doctor, soldier, and reluctant creator of legend, gifted the world Sherlock Holmes, a detective who didn't just chase criminals, but confronted the very architecture of evil with unmatched precision. But fame is a double-edged sword. By the 1890s, Holmes had become more than just a character. He was a phenomenon. Readers couldn't get enough. But Doyle, the man behind the myth, felt trapped. He feared Holmes was overshadowing his literary ambitions. In his own words, he was weary of his name. And so, Doyle made a radical decision. He would kill off Sherlock Holmes. He would give him a death worthy of his greatness. But what happens when a mind that defends justice meets the mind that orchestrates darkness? In today's story, The Final Problem, Holmes meets his ultimate adversary, Professor Moriarty, the hidden hand behind Europe's most sinister crimes. A man with no face in the public eye, yet whose influence stretches like a web across the continent. It's a deadly race, across borders, through danger, betrayal, and ambition. At stake, not just lives, but the very soul of justice. And as Doyle penned this fateful tale, he wasn't just writing an ending. He was orchestrating a duel between two titanic intellects, one that would echo through literary history. So if you believe that every great mind must one day meet its equal, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of Stories. Now, step into the dim-lit corridors of danger, as Holmes prepares for a battle not of bullets, but of will, wit, and destiny. This is The Final Problem. It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these final words, words in which I shall ever record the extraordinary gifts that made my dear friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, unlike any other man I've known. In all honesty, I know that my efforts have been flawed, incoherent, and deeply inadequate, but I tried to capture the strange and unforgettable experiences we shared. From the very first moment fate brought us together, during the case of study in Scarlet, to his remarkable intervention in a naval treaty, where, once again, he saved not just one man's future, but perhaps the peace of nations. It had been my intention to stop there, to let that be the end of the public record, to say nothing more about what followed. But how does one silence a memory that never fades? How does one fill a void that even 2 long years have not healed? And now, as I face the shadows left behind, I find that I cannot remain silent. My hand has been forced by recent letters from Colonel James Moriarty, letters in which he seeks to defend the memory of his brother. I now have no choice but to place the truth before the public, exactly as it happened. I alone know the full story, and I believe that the time has come when keeping it hidden serves no purpose at all. To my knowledge, there have been only 3 public accounts of the matter. One, in the Journal de Genève on May 6, 1891. Another, a brief Reuters dispatch in the English newspapers on May 7th. And the last, that recent letter I just mentioned. The first 2 were little more than fragments. The third is, as I shall now prove, a complete distortion of the facts. It falls upon me, and me alone, to tell for the first time what really transpired between Professor Moriarty and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You may recall that after my marriage, and after I began my own private practice, the closeness between Holmes and myself naturally began to change. He would still come to me when he needed a companion in some investigation, but those visits grew less and less frequent. In fact, I now see that in the entire year of 1890, there were only 3 cases for which I've kept any record. Then, during that winter and the early spring of 1891, I read in the papers that Holmes had been retained by the French government in a matter of great urgency. I received 2 short notes from him, one from Narbonne, the other from Nîmes, from which I gathered that he would be in France for quite some time. So you can imagine my surprise when, on the evening of April 24th, he walked, quietly and without warning, into my consulting room. It struck me at once. He looked even paler and thinner than usual.
Yes, I've been overworking myself a bit,
he remarked, responding more to my expression than to any words I'd spoken.
I've been under a bit of pressure lately. Do you mind if I close your shutters?
The only light in the room came from the lamp on the table where I had been reading. Holmes moved along the wall, closed the shutters, and bolted them securely. I asked, "You're afraid of something?"
Yes, I am.
"A what?"
Air guns.
"My dear Holmes, what are you talking about?"
You know me well enough, Watson, to understand that I'm not a nervous man, but it's foolish, not brave, to ignore danger when it's close. Could I trouble you for a match?
He inhaled deeply on his cigarette, as if the calming effect was welcome.
I must apologize for calling so late, and I must ask you to be unconventional enough to allow me to leave your house later by climbing over your back garden wall.
But what does all this mean? He held out his hand, and I saw in the lamplight that 2 of his knuckles were bruised and bleeding.
It's not imaginary, as you can see. On the contrary, it's solid enough to bust a man's hand. Is Mrs. Watson home?
She's away visiting.
Indeed. So you're alone?
Completely.
That makes it easier for me to suggest you come with me to the continent for a week.
Where?
Anywhere. It doesn't matter.
There was something very strange about it all. It wasn't in Holmes's nature to take random holidays, and something in his pale, drawn face told me that his nerves were under immense strain. He must have seen the question in my eyes, for he placed his fingertips together, rested his elbows on his knees, and began to explain.
You've probably never heard of Professor Moriarty?
Never.
Remarkable, truly. That's the genius and the wonder of it. The man permeates London, yet no one has heard of him. That's what puts him on a pedestal in the criminal world. I'm telling you seriously, Watson. If I could beat that man, if I could rid society of him, I'd feel my career had reached its pinnacle, and I'd be ready to retire and live quietly, focusing on my chemical research. But I can't rest, Watson. I can't sit still knowing that such a man walks free through the streets of London.
What has he done?
His life has been an extraordinary one. He's of good birth and fine education, with a natural gift for mathematics. At 21, he wrote a treatise on the binomial theorem that gained international acclaim. On that basis, he was awarded the chair of mathematics at a small university and seemed set for a brilliant career. But he had inherited the most diabolical tendencies. A criminal streak ran in his blood, one that became even more dangerous due to his intellect. Dark rumors began to surround him in the university town, and eventually, he was forced to resign. He came down to London and began working as an army tutor. That much the world knows. What I'm telling you now is what I've uncovered personally. You know I'm familiar with London's criminal underworld better than anyone. For years, I sensed a hidden power behind criminals, a central figure who organized and protected them. Time and again, in cases of forgery, robbery, and murder, I felt his presence, and I traced this presence through countless twists and turns until it led me to ex-Professor Moriarty. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson, the mastermind behind half of what's evil and nearly everything undetected in this city. He's a genius, a philosopher, a brilliant strategist. He does very little himself, he plans. He sits motionless like a spider at the center of a vast web. That web has 1,000 strands, and he knows every vibration in it. His agents are numerous and well organized. If a crime needs to be committed, a document stolen, a house burglarized, a man eliminated, Moriarty gives the word, and it's done. The agent might get caught, but bail and defense are taken care of. The central figure, the professor, is never even suspected. This is the organization I've uncovered, Watson. I've spent all my energy trying to bring it down, but Moriarty is surrounded by clever defenses. Despite all my abilities, I couldn't find evidence strong enough to convict him. For 3 months, I matched wits with a mind equal to mine. I was horrified by his crimes, but fascinated by his brilliance. Then he made a single misstep, small but enough. I saw my chance, and from there I built my net. In 3 days, Monday, the trap will spring, and he and his top men will be arrested. It'll be the criminal trial of the century. 40 mysteries will be solved. But if we act too early, he could still escape.
But if he knows,
He does. That's the problem. I wish I could have acted without his knowledge, but he's too sharp. He's seen every move I've made. Again and again, he tried to break free, but I was always one step ahead. Watson, if that cat and mouse game were ever written down, it would be a masterpiece of detection. I've never been so challenged. He struck hard, and I had to strike harder. Just this morning, the final steps were taken. We only need 3 more days. I was in my room, reviewing everything, when the door opened, and there he stood, Professor Moriarty himself. My nerves are usually strong, Watson, but I jumped when I saw the man who had haunted my thoughts standing before me. I knew him well by sight, tall, thin, with a domed forehead and deep-set eyes. He's clean-shaven, pale, with an ascetic, professor-like appearance. His shoulders are hunched from years of study, and his head moves slowly from side to side like a reptile. He studied me with curious eyes.
You have less frontal development than I expected. It's a dangerous habit to play with loaded firearms in your dressing gown pocket.
You see, the moment he entered, I recognized the danger I was in. The only way he could escape now was by silencing me permanently. I slipped my revolver from the drawer into my pocket and was aiming at him through the fabric. When he made that comment, I laid the revolver, cocked, on the table. He continued to smile, but his eyes told me I was right to be cautious.
You evidently don't know me,
he said, and I answered, on the contrary, I think it is fairly evident that I do. Please take a seat. I can spare you 5 minutes if you have anything to say.
All that I have to say has already crossed your mind.
Then possibly my answer has crossed yours.
You stand fast?
Absolutely. He reached into his pocket, and I raised my pistol from the table. But he only pulled out a small memorandum book filled with dates.
You crossed my path on January 4th. On the 23rd, you incommoded me. By mid-February, I was seriously inconvenienced by you. By the end of March, my plans were fully obstructed. And now, at the close of April, because of your constant interference, I find myself in real danger of losing my liberty. The situation is becoming impossible.
Do you have any suggestion to offer?
You must drop it, Mr. Holmes. You really must, you know?
After Monday.
What a shame. I'm sure a man of your intellect must realize there can be only one outcome to this matter. You have arranged things in such a way that we have only one option left. It's been an intellectual delight watching you tackle this case, and I say sincerely, it would genuinely grieve me to have to resort to extreme measures. You may smile, but I assure you it would.
Danger is part of my trade.
This is not danger. This is inevitable destruction. You're not opposing a man, Mr. Holmes. You're opposing a vast organization, one whose full scale even you haven't grasped. You must step aside or be crushed underfoot.
I'm afraid I've lingered too long in this delightful chat, and I must attend to some pressing business elsewhere. Professor Moriarty stood as well, looking at me silently, shaking his head with regret.
Well, it's a pity, but I've done what I could. I know every move in your game. You can't act before Monday. This has been a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. You hope to place me in the dock, but I tell you, I will never stand in the dock. You hope to beat me. I tell you, you never will. And if you are clever enough to destroy me, rest assured, I will destroy you in return.
You've paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty. Allow me to return the gesture by saying, if I could be certain of your defeat, I would gladly accept my own, in the interest of the public.
I can promise you the one, but not the other.
And with that, he turned his hunched back toward me and walked out of the room, blinking and peering as he went. That was my strange meeting with Professor Moriarty. I must admit, it left an unsettling impression. His calm, meticulous speech carried a weight that a mere brute could never convey. Now, you might ask, why not seek police protection? But I'm certain, Watson, that the blow will come not from him, but from one of his agents. I have the best reasons to believe so.
You've already been attacked?
My dear Watson, Professor Moriarty doesn't let the grass grow under his feet. Around noon, I went out for some business on Oxford Street. As I reached the corner of Bentinck Street, near Welbeck Street crossing, a 2-horse van came tearing around the corner straight at me. I leapt to the pavement and escaped by a fraction of a second. The van turned into Marylebone Lane and disappeared instantly. After that, I stuck to the sidewalk, but while walking down Vere Street, a brick suddenly dropped from a rooftop, shattering on the pavement near me. I called the police and had them inspect the place. Apparently, there were bricks and slates stacked up there for roof repairs, and they claimed the wind had knocked one down. Of course, I knew better, but I couldn't prove anything. So, I took a cab and spent the rest of the day at my brother's place in Pall Mall. On my way here, a thug with a club tried to ambush me. I knocked him flat. He's in police custody now. But trust me, there's no chance anyone will ever connect that thug, whose teeth I split with my knuckles, with a quiet math tutor who's probably doing algebra 10 miles away. That's why I closed your shutters the moment I entered, Watson, and why I must leave your house through a less noticeable route than the front door.
I had often admired my friend's courage, but never more than now, as he sat calmly reviewing a string of events that surely made up a day of horror. I said, "You will spend the night here?"
No, my friend. You might find me a dangerous guest. I have my plans laid, and all will be well. Matters have gone so far now that they can move without my help as far as the arrest goes, though my presence is necessary for conviction. It is obvious, therefore, that I cannot do better than get away for the few days which remain before the police are at liberty to act. It would be a great pleasure to me, therefore, if you could come on to the continent with me.
The practice is quiet, and I have an accommodating neighbor. I should be glad to come.
And to start tomorrow morning?
If necessary.
Oh yes, it is most necessary. Then these are your instructions, and I beg, my dear Watson, that you will obey them to the letter. For you are now playing a double-handed game with me against the cleverest rogue and the most powerful syndicate of criminals in Europe. Now listen, you will dispatch whatever luggage you intend to take by a trusty messenger unaddressed to Victoria tonight. In the morning you will send for a hansom, desiring your man to take neither the first nor the second which may present itself. Into this hansom you will jump, and you will drive to the Strand end of the Lowther Arcade, handing the address to the cabman upon a slip of paper, with a request that he will not throw it away. Have your fare ready, and the instant that your cab stops, dash through the arcade, timing yourself to reach the other side at 9:15. You will find a small brougham waiting close to the curb, driven by a fellow with a heavy black cloak tipped at the collar with red. Into this you will step, and you will reach Victoria in time for the Continental Express.
Where shall I meet you?
At the station. The second first-class carriage from the front will be reserved for us.
The carriage is our rendezvous. Then?
Yes.
It was in vain that I asked Holmes to remain for the evening. It was clear to me that he believed his presence might bring danger to the household, and that was the reason for his departure. With a few hurried words regarding our plans for the next day, he stood up and went out with me into the garden, climbed over the wall that leads into Mortimer Street, and immediately whistled for a hansom, in which I heard him drive away. In the morning, I followed Holmes's instructions to the letter. A hansom was secured with such care as to avoid those that might have been placed in readiness for us, and I drove off just after breakfast to the Lowther Arcade. I rushed through it as quickly as I could. A brougham was waiting with a large driver wrapped in a dark cloak. The moment I stepped inside, he whipped the horse and sped off to Victoria Station. As I got down, the driver turned the carriage and raced off again without even glancing in my direction. So far, everything had gone perfectly. My luggage was there, and I had no trouble finding the carriage Holmes mentioned, especially since it was the only one marked engaged. My only concern now was Holmes's absence. The station clock showed just 7 minutes until departure. I searched in vain among the groups of travelers and those saying their goodbyes. There was no sign of my friend's familiar figure. For a few minutes, I helped an elderly Italian priest who was struggling to make a porter understand, in his broken English, that his luggage was to be booked through to Paris. Afterward, I took another quick look around and returned to my carriage, where I found that the porter, despite the ticket, had assigned the aged Italian clergyman as my traveling companion. It was pointless to tell him that his presence was uninvited, as my Italian was even more limited than his English. So I simply shrugged and sat, still looking anxiously for Holmes. A chill of fear swept over me at the thought that his absence might mean something had happened during the night. The doors were already shut, and the whistle had blown when,
"My dear Watson,"
said a voice.
"you have not even condescended to say good morning."
I turned in absolute astonishment. The aged priest had turned to face me. For a moment, the wrinkles vanished. The nose moved away from the chin. The lower lip stopped jutting out, and the mumbling mouth became firm. The dull eyes lit up, and the slouched figure straightened. And then, in the very next moment, the disguise returned, and Holmes was gone as swiftly as he had revealed himself. Good heavens, how you startle me.
Every precaution is still necessary. I have reason to think that they are hot upon our trail. Ah, there's Moriarty himself.
The train had already begun to move as Holmes spoke. Glancing back, I saw a tall man pushing furiously through the crowd and waving his hand as if trying to stop the train. But it was too late. We were picking up speed and had already cleared the station.
With all our precautions, you see that we have cut it rather fine.
He stood up and, removing the black cassock and hat of his disguise, packed them neatly into a handbag.
Have you seen the morning paper, Watson?
I answered no.
You haven't seen about Baker Street, then?
Baker Street?
They set fire to our rooms last night. No great harm was done.
Good heavens, Holmes. This is intolerable.
They must have lost my track completely after their bludgeon man was arrested. Otherwise, they could not have believed I had returned to my rooms. They've clearly taken the precaution of watching you, though, and that's why Moriarty came to Victoria. You didn't make any slip in coming?
I did exactly what you advised.
Did you find your brougham?
Yes, it was waiting.
Did you recognize your coachman?
No.
It was my brother Mycroft. It's an advantage to move about in such matters without involving someone for hire. But now we must plan what to do about Moriarty.
As this is an express, and since the boat is connected with it, I think we've shaken him off effectively.
My dear Watson, you clearly didn't grasp my meaning when I said that this man is intellectually my equal. You don't imagine that if I were in pursuit, a small obstacle like this would stop me? Why, then, think so little of him?
What will he do?
What I would do?
What would you do then?
Engage a special.
But must be late.
Not at all. This train stops at Canterbury, and there's always at least a 15-minute delay at the boat. He'll catch us there.
One would think we were the criminals. Let's have him arrested when he arrives.
That would ruin the work of 3 months. We get the big fish, but the smaller ones would scatter. By Monday, we'll have them all. No, an arrest is out of the question.
What then?
We shall get out at Canterbury.
And then?
Well, then we must make a cross-country journey to New Haven, and from there to Dieppe. Moriarty will do what I would. Head to Paris, trace our luggage, and wait at the depot for 2 days. Meanwhile, we'll buy a couple of carpetbags, support local industry as we travel, and make our way into Switzerland at our leisure via Luxembourg and Basel.
At Canterbury, then, we got off, only to find we had to wait an hour for a train to New Haven. I was still looking rather gloomily at the disappearing luggage van that contained my wardrobe when Holmes tugged my sleeve and pointed down the track.
Already, you see.
Far off among the Kinnish woods, a thin trail of smoke rose. A moment later, a carriage and engine sped along the open curve toward the station. We had barely enough time to hide behind a pile of luggage before it rushed past with a roar, blasting us with hot air.
There he goes. You see, even his intelligence has limits. It would have been a master stroke if he had deduced what I would deduce, and acted accordingly.
And what would he have done if he had caught up with us?
There's no doubt he would have launched a murderous attack on me. But it's a game two can play. The only question now is whether we grab an early lunch here or risk starving until we reach the buffet at New Haven.
That night we reached Brussels and spent 2 days there, moving on to Strasbourg on the 3rd day. On Monday morning, Holmes sent a telegram to the London police, and by evening, we found a reply waiting at our hotel. Holmes tore it open and, with a bitter curse, flung it into the fireplace.
I might have known it. He has escaped.
Moriarty?
They got the whole gang. Accept him. He slipped through. Of course, once I left the country, no one was left to deal with him. Still, I thought I put the game in their hands. I think you should return to England, Watson.
What for?
Because you'll find me a dangerous companion now. That man has nothing left. If he returns to London, he's finished. And if I've read his character correctly, he'll now use every ounce of strength to get revenge on me. He said as much when we met briefly, and I believe he meant it. I strongly advise you to return to your practice.
It was hardly the kind of appeal that could succeed with someone like Holmes. Not with a man who was both a seasoned campaigner and an old friend. We sat for nearly half an hour, arguing quietly in the Strasbourg dining room. But that very night, we resumed our journey. By morning, we were already well on our way to Geneva. What followed was a truly delightful week. We wandered through the Rhone Valley, its lower slopes blooming with the tender green of spring, while high above, winter still reigned, pure and white. From Luc, we branched off and crossed the Gemmi Pass, still buried in snow, and made our way through Interlaken to Meiringen. The journey was breathtaking, but even amid the beauty, I could see it in Holmes. He never, for one moment, forgot the shadow that hung over him. Whether we were walking through quaint alpine villages or treading the solitary mountain paths, his eyes were always moving, quick, sharp alert, as though he felt that danger walked just a few paces behind us. There's one moment I remember clearly. We were crossing the Gemmi, walking beside the gloomy waters of the Dobbin Sea, when suddenly a large stone crashed down from the ridge above, splashing into the lake just behind us. Without a word, Holmes dashed up the ridge, and from a high point scanned the cliffs and valleys, his gaze sharp, watchful, calculating. Our guide tried to reassure us. He said rock falls like they were common in spring, but Holmes didn't reply. He simply looked down at me and smiled, like a man who had just seen proof of what he already feared was true. And yet, despite all this, he never seemed weighed down. On the contrary, I don't think I ever saw him in such high spirits. Again and again, he spoke of one thing, that if he could be certain, truly certain, that society was free of Professor Moriarty, he would gladly, peacefully, bring his career to a close.
I think I may go so far as to say, Watson, that I have not lived wholly in vain. If my record were to close tonight, I could still look back on it with calm satisfaction. The air of London is cleaner from my presence. In over 1,000 cases, I don't believe I ever used my abilities on the wrong side. Lately, I felt tempted to explore the problems of nature instead of those more superficial ones born of our artificial society. Your memoirs will come to a close, Watson, on the day I crown my career with the capture or extinction of the most dangerous and capable criminal in Europe.
I will be brief, but exact in telling what remains. It is not a topic I like to dwell on, yet I feel a responsibility to omit no detail. On May 3rd, we reached the small village of Meiringen, where we stayed at the Englischer Hof, then run by Peter Steiler the Elder. Our host was intelligent and spoke excellent English, having worked for 3 years as a waiter at the Grosvenor Hotel in London. On his advice, we set out on the afternoon of the 4th with plans to cross the hills and spend the night in the hamlet of Rosenlaui. He firmly instructed us, however, not to pass the Reichenbach Falls, about halfway up the hill, without making a short detour to see them. It was a sight both magnificent and terrifying. The swollen torrent, fed by melting snow, plunging into a vast, smoke-like spray that rose from a black abyss. The river hurled itself into a chasm lined with gleaming coal-dark rock, narrowing into a furious, boiling pit that seemed to swallow the world. The endless rush of green water and the rising mist deafened the ears, dazzled the eyes. We stood at the edge, gazing down at the shattered white foam far below, listening to that deep, almost human roar that echoed from the depths. The viewing path curved halfway around the falls before it abruptly ended, forcing one to turn back. Just as we did, a Swiss boy arrived with a letter from our hotel. A dying English lady, struck by sudden hemorrhage, had just arrived, desperately asking to see an English doctor. The landlord pleaded that I return at once, calling it a personal favor, for she refused to see a Swiss physician and had only hours left. I couldn't ignore the request, though I hesitated to leave Holmes. At last, we agreed. He would remain at the falls with the boy as companion, and I would go to Meiringen, planning to meet again at Rosenlaui that evening. As I walked away, I looked back one last time. Holmes stood alone, his back against a rock, arms folded, staring silently into the crashing waters below. It was the final image I would ever carry of him. As I descended the slope, I turned once more. The falls were hidden now, but I saw the curved path winding toward them, and on it, a man walking swiftly, his dark figure stark against the green. I noticed the energy in his stride, but thought little of it, and turned away. It may have been just over an hour by the time I arrived at Meiringen. As I approached the hotel, I saw old Steiler standing at the porch, his face grave, his hands clasped before him. I hurried up the steps, breathless from the walk, and with real concern in my voice, I asked, "Well, I trust that she's no worse?" A look of surprise crossed the landlord's face, and at the first twitch of his eyebrows, a sense of dread struck deep into my chest. You didn't write this?" I pulled the letter from my pocket, unfolding it with trembling fingers. "There's no sick Englishwoman in the hotel?"
Certainly not, but it has the hotel mark upon it. Ha! It must have been written by that tall Englishman who came in after you had gone. He said,
But I waited for no further explanation. A surge of fear pushed me forward, and I was already sprinting down the village street, making my way back up the path I had descended so recently. Though it had taken me an hour to come down, it took 2 more, despite my best efforts, before I finally reached the Reichenbach Falls again. Holmes's alpine stock was still leaning where I had last seen him, silent, unmoved, against the bare rock. But he was gone. I called out his name again and again, and all I heard in return was the echo of my own voice, drifting hollow and ghost-like through the cliffs. That single stick, so still and alone on that narrow ledge, with a cliff wall on one side and death on the other, struck me with a cold certainty I could scarcely bear. He had never left for Rosenlaui. He had waited there until Moriarty found him. The young Swiss guide had vanished as well, and in that dreadful silence, I could not help but see the truth. The 2 men had been left alone, deliberately, fatally. What followed, only God could know. For some time, I stood frozen. Then, as Holmes would have done, I forced myself to think. The alpine stock marked the very spot where we had last spoken. The earth, always damp from the falls, was soft and clear. 2 sets of footprints led forward. None returned. Farther on, the ground was churned and torn, branches broken, ferns trampled, as though by a struggle near the edge. I lay down and looked over. The spray from the falls clung to my face as I peered into the abyss. It had grown darker now, and I could barely make out the slick glint of wet stone, and far below, the broken white shimmer of water. I shouted, but only the deep, almost human roar of the falls came back to me. And yet, fate had one final message for me from my friend and comrade. I had mentioned Holmes's alpine stock leaning against a rock that jutted onto the path. From atop that boulder, I caught the glint of something bright. Reaching for it, I found Holmes's silver cigarette case. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper, 3 pages torn from his notebook, addressed to me. It was entirely like Holmes that the address was exact and the handwriting steady and clear, as though penned in the calm of his study.
My dear Watson, I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who is waiting on my convenience to resolve the matters between us. He has explained the methods by which he evaded the English police and tracked our movements. These details only confirm the high opinion I held of his abilities. I take satisfaction in knowing that I may now rid society of his influence, though it may come at a cost that brings pain to my friends, especially to you, dear Watson. I've told you already that my career had reached its crisis. and no end could suit me better than this, to confess the full truth. I suspected from the start that the letter from Meringen was a ruse. I allowed you to go, anticipating that something like this might unfold. Please tell Inspector Patterson that the documents necessary for convicting the gang are in Pigeonhole M, wrapped in a blue envelope marked Moriarty. I made all arrangements for my property before leaving England and entrusted them to my brother Mycroft. Give my regards to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
A few words will suffice to close what little remains. Experts later examined the site and agreed. A struggle had occurred between the two men, ending, as it almost inevitably would, with both tumbling over the edge, locked in each other's arms. There was no hope of recovering the bodies. Deep within that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and crashing foam now lies, for all time, both the deadliest criminal and the greatest champion of justice of their generation. The Swiss youth was never found again, leaving no doubt that he had been among the many agents Moriarty employed. As for the gang, the public will remember how fully Holmes's gathered evidence revealed their entire organization, and how crushingly the hand of a dead man fell upon them. Very little about their dreadful leader emerged during the legal proceedings, and if I now feel compelled to publicly recount his career, it is only because of those misguided defenders who have tried to clear his name by attacking the one man I will always regard as the best and wisest human being I have ever known. And thus ended the life of Sherlock Holmes, England's greatest detective, locked in mortal combat with the most formidable criminal mind of his era. In the roaring heart of the Reichenbach Falls, hero and villain disappeared into the abyss forever. But you may wonder, my friend, why Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Holmes's very creator, chose to end his legendary detective in such a final way. The answer lies not in fiction, but in the weariness of a writer. By 1893, Conan Doyle felt trapped by his own creation. Holmes had overshadowed all else he wrote. In his own words, he takes my mind from better things. And so, in the final problem, he brought Holmes's story to a dramatic conclusion, intending it to be the last. It was a bold, even shocking decision. But Doyle believed that Holmes's death, noble and heroic, would free him to pursue more serious literature. Little did he know, the world would not let Sherlock Holmes go so easily. Such was the love, the outrage, the mourning from fans across the globe, that even death at Reichenbach could not contain the great detective. But that is a story for another time. Until then, this has been Echoes of Stories. Thank you for listening. Stay curious, stay brilliant, and as Holmes might say,
The game is afoot, and yes, elementary, my dear Watson.